Hi, this is John Foubert. I'm here this week to talk about Nevitt Sanford. Nevitt Sanford is really one of the first, if not the first, student development theorists who talked about college students and how they learn and grow during their college experience. Now, a lot of people look down on Sanford a little bit because they think that his theory was very pedestrian, not very complex. And from my perspective, a lot of that point of view comes from simply not reading what he wrote and only relying on what other people say about him through secondary sources. And so I've done a lot of research on Nevitt Sanford, his background, his theories, and how he came to some conclusions. And I want to give you an appreciation today for who was Nevitt Sanford, the person, and who was Nevitt Sanford, the theorist. Because I think if we understand the person behind the theory, we can better understand that theory. And I want to go into some more depth than you probably have heard about Nevitt Sanford, so we can learn about what his thoughts are on helping college students grow, learn, and develop. Now, this presentation is also on a PowerPoint, or at least the slides go with this presentation. So I encourage you to follow along. It's Nevitt Sanford, a foundational student development theorist in all his complexity by John Foubert. And so please do follow along, and we'll move to slide 2. Who was Nevitt Sanford? There's a picture of him right there on the slide. And that's actually from an interview he did with ACPA back in the 1980s. And I encourage you to take a look at that video. I will give you the URL later on in this presentation. But I also think it's always interesting for us to see who are these theorists, and so we can keep in our mind who is this person and what do they look like and who are they. Slide 3, if you look at Sanford's upbringing, he was born in 1909 and died in 1995. He came from a family of Baptists, and particularly Baptist ministers. Both his father and his grandfather were Baptist ministers. He went to undergraduate school at the University of Richmond in Virginia. There are some places that say that he went to the University of Virginia. That is not correct. He went to the University of Richmond in Virginia. So that, I hope, will clear up a little bit of information, and there's some research in the archives at the University of Richmond showing his student times there. He went from Richmond to Columbia University and got his master's degree there, and then earned his PhD in psychology from Harvard. When he was getting degrees, there really weren't many, if any, student affairs programs out there, and he's a psychologist. He studied psychology and actually studied a lot of interesting things you may not have heard of, so we'll talk about those as well. Now, slide 4, his early career, he was a professor of psychology after he earned his PhD, and he started off at the University of California at Berkeley, and that was back in 1940, so he went from one coast to another. Now, if you think about it, what was going on at that point in history? 1940. This is in the midst of World War II. The Nazis were imprisoning Jews in concentration camps. And so that's sort of the cultural milieu through which he developed his theory. And in 1943, as a professor, he was offered a $500 grant to study anti-Semitism at Berkeley. Now, in today's money, $500 probably doesn't sound like too much, at least for a research grant. But back then, that was a chunk of change that he could use to study anti-Semitism. And he was very interested in joining what he called, his quote is, it was an opportunity to join the scientific attack on fascism. And so he was interested in using research to confront ills in society, which I find very, very interesting. Now, with that grant, he constructed a scale for measuring anti-Semitism, because as we study different topics, in order to understand something, we need to be able to measure it from a researcher's perspective. So he thought he would develop a scale, a survey questionnaire essentially, for measuring anti-Semitism. And that's one of his first research projects as a professor. Now on slide 5, you can see that his work obviously, was designed and inspired by trying to understand the hatred that caused the Holocaust. Why? How can a man like Hitler lead a movement where Jews could be imprisoned in concentration camps and treated as certainly much less than human? There was a curiosity to him, so he studied that. And the interesting thing about his research is that his research on anti-Semitism then led to later research on prejudice. That he also helped to found the theory of social psychology, which of course is the influence of or the presence of others on the individual. So he's quite an accomplished scholar, and we'll actually talk about his productivity on slide 6. He published nearly 200 scholarly articles and more than a dozen books. That is an amazing feat by any standard of scholarship. So he was prolific. Now, the first scholarly work that gained him a good deal of attention was called The Authoritarian Personality. It was published in 1950. And he wanted to make sure that he was true to the study of anti-Semitism. So he chose as co-authors 2 refugees from Nazi persecution, which also made his work more personal. In the sense of having a personal commitment to that study. And he published that book in 1950, which I guess he would have been about 41 at the time. So in The Authoritarian Personality, on slide 7, we can see that he wanted to trace the links between a child's upbringing and then their prejudice in adulthood. So how do experiences as a kid relate then to certain prejudices you have later on? And he showed that people who are prejudiced against one ethnic or racial or religious group also tended to be prejudiced against others. So essentially, he showed that people were equal opportunity prejudiced people. In a manner of speaking. So if they're prejudiced against one group, that tends to translate to prejudice against another. And he was real interested and concerned with how some social conditions, think about Nazi Germany, how some social conditions could encourage people with these dogmatic biases that were present during the Holocaust to persecute groups they were prejudiced against. So not only the thought of prejudging an individual, but then acting on that was a big part of his work in The Authoritarian Personality. Now, on slide 8, I want to talk a little bit about how he was part of what's referred to in the history of higher education in various places as the Fearsome Five. Now, think for a bit about what was happening in the 1950s. Senator Joe McCarthy, what was he doing? Well, at the time, McCarthy was trying to root down communists, and he was convinced that we just needed to get anybody who was communist out of the United States because it was a threat to the United States. And if you go back and look at some old YouTube videos or whichever and take a look at how he called people before the U.S. Senate and put them under oath and wanted to know, are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? He was on a witch hunt, essentially, for communists. And he figured that a lot of communists were probably located at these colleges and universities. And so the University of California at Berkeley, under the influence of the federal government, asked their professors to sign a loyalty oath to the United States. And it read, like there on the slide, I do not belong to or believe in any organization that believes in the overthrow of the government by force or violence. That really ticked off Nevitt Sanford, that he was asked to sign that. And it ticked off a whole lot of professors at Berkeley, but most of them buckled. Most of them just went ahead and signed it. Nevitt Sanford and 4 others did not. And so Berkeley fired him. And they fired him for not signing the piece of paper. Now, there is no indication at all, not that it matters, but anyway, there's no indication at all that Nevitt Sanford was a communist or communist sympathizer, but he was very much an academic who believed in academic freedom, and he was not going to sign some loyalty oath at his place of employment. So he stood by his principles. On slide 9, one of the things that he is reported to have said at that point in history is that no political test should be used in deciding who would be teaching at the university. He did not think that politics should play into who's allowed to teach and who is not allowed to teach at our colleges and universities. So one of the early defenders, at least in the 20th century, of academic freedom. Now, he supported, obviously, the freedom of thought, and part of his not signing that loyalty oath, he was quoted as saying, "If we could punish people with extremely unpopular opinions, then we could silence people with less unpopular opinions." And then he described that as a slippery slope. We could continue to punish people that we just don't agree with and have them not teach at colleges and universities. That really motivated him, so much so he was willing to lose his job over it. So he left. And after he was fired, he, of course, filed suit against Berkeley, which we'll talk about in a minute. But he went over to London. He said, "The heck with this. Not only the heck with Berkeley, but the heck with U.S. higher education. I'm out of here." So he went over to the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations in London. And he was there for a year. And I think, from all the reading I've been able to do, he longed for home. He was there and he studied there and he was able to do much of what he wanted there, but he wanted to get back to the U.S. So he then joined the faculty of Vassar College, a women's college, part of what's called the Seven Sisters, which back in the day where we had higher education segregated between men and women, Vassar was one of the Seven Sisters that was one of the 7 schools that complemented the all-male Ivy League. And so it was an institution in New York that was thought very highly of. Now, here's a very interesting point and an important point to remember. While he was at Vassar, he began to develop his theory that we'll go into in some detail. He did this at a school that had only women. So occasionally people will say, well, Nevitt Sanford, he just studied rich white men. And that, in fact, isn't true. He studied and developed his theory originally on, well, rich white women, primarily. But I think it's important to understand that it isn't just males he studied, but females. And in fact, when he developed his early theory, he studied females at Vassar. Now, in 1955, a couple of years after he was fired, he was reinstated to Berkeley with back pay. He won his lawsuit. Which is, I think, a major step forward in academic freedom and guaranteeing that to the professoriate in the United States. So he was able to be reinstated, and he went back to Berkeley. And based on the readings I've done, it was not the same. Not that it was great for him there, certainly after he was fired around that time. But there was a part of Berkeley he really liked. Now, when he got back to Berkeley, it just didn't go as he wanted to. So he left in 1960. And almost as in a way that could be interpreted as a dig to Berkeley, he went to Stanford. And if you understand the relations between universities in California, Berkeley is thought of as the top academic institution in California that is public. Stanford, the top academic institution in California that's private. So there's quite a rivalry between the two. And his going to Stanford could be certainly perceived as a slap in the face against Berkeley. So he went there. He was there for 8 years at Stanford. And then finally he realized, I really want to do my own thing. I don't want people telling me what to do and getting in my way. I want to study what I want and on my own time. So he figured, I'll form my own institute, and he did that successfully. He named it the Wright Institute, and some of the reading I've done suggests that it was his wife's maiden name, so the name of his wife's parents. Their last name was Wright. He couldn't figure out what to name it, so he's just like, well, the Wright Institute, and so he did that to do his own thing. Now, on slide 12, he, in his history as a scholar, there were really 2 major books that he published about college students. The first being The American College, and that's the one that's sort of the classic that many older professors, and I guess I'm rapidly reaching that group, have his book, The American College, on their bookshelf. It's out of print now. If you can get a copy on Amazon or whichever, I'd encourage you to. It's a classic in higher ed, and really full of a lot of wisdom. So now he based the American College on data he gathered from women at Vassar in 1962. And then he refined his theory based on students that he worked with at both Sanford and Berkeley. So he studied both women and men in developing that theory. Now, he published that book, and then he went on a book tour. It was very popular, and so lots of universities asked him to come speak. And so what he did on that book tour was he developed different speeches for different audiences where he spoke, and he wrote those speeches out word for word, and then published that series of speeches as a book, Where Colleges Fail, and he published that in 1967. So the American College being his first really big book about college students, everybody wanted to hear about it, so he went visiting all these campuses, and those speeches then became the next book, Where Colleges Fail. So in the book Where Colleges Fail, he talked about many different issues. He said that colleges should teach social responsibility, and he was also interested not just in what happened in the classroom, but what happened outside the classroom. So he wanted to figure out and make sure that he encouraged universities to help students integrate their personality. Now, that's kind of a complex psychological phrase, but he wanted universities to take a strong lead role in helping students to figure out how can they be people of integrity, how can they understand who they are as individuals and be a whole person. So, big part of Sanford's beliefs. He believed that we should educate folks for world citizenship. Those of you who have read the document, The Student Personnel Point of View, will note the similarities there. And he believed in mentoring. He was a huge fan of mentoring and believed that professors should actively mentor students, take them under their wing, and teach them in many different ways. So he defined development and what that meant. So as we think about college student development theory, one of the things that he helped us to define was development itself. And what he described development as is the organization of increasing complexity. Now that too might sound a little complex, but when he thought about, when the college freshman, first year student who then progresses through to being a senior, that they develop more complex ways of interacting with the world. They develop more complex ways of thinking, acting, doing, interacting with others. And that complexity becomes organized within the individual as a set of characteristics that really forms their personality. And Sanford believed that we needed, as people who work at colleges and universities, to be active in encouraging that process. Now, slide 14, you might also find it interesting that Sanford was an early critic of IQ tests. He said that they were really just biased in favor of the white middle class, and that they should not be so biased. So that helped to lend credence to many people who argued against IQ tests as any kind of marker for what someone should do in school or in life or whichever. He also was an early advocate of accessibility. In the 21st century, there are lots of people who emphasize accessibility to a college degree and the importance of that, and making a college degree more accessible to a larger part of the population. Well, Sanford was talking about that a long time ago. Certainly not quite a century, but quite some time. So I want to give you a sense of some of the terms that Sanford developed and postulated. Now, if you look there at slide 15, there are several different terms that he developed. We'll define each one, but on that particular slide, if you're taking one of my classes, as I suspect you are if you're watching this, those are the places where you can find where he wrote about those particular concepts, or where others have written about them. So we'll talk about each one of those. But it's when people think of Sanford, usually they just think of the words challenge and support, and they think that's all that there was to Sanford. Not so. Much more to Sanford than challenge and support, as you can see on the slide, and we'll go through and we'll talk about each. Slide 16, I want to begin talking about his concepts that he developed by talking about readiness. Now, you might hear, just colloquially speaking, people talk about, well, that person wasn't ready for college yet. Like if they were 18, went straight to college, had a first year that didn't go so well, some people will say that they weren't really ready. Well, readiness has both a colloquial meaning but also a psychological meaning, a scholarly meaning. So, readiness, as defined by Sanford and the American College, quote, certain kinds of responses cannot be made unless certain states or conditions have been built up in the person. Change in the personality is induced largely by stimuli arising either from the person's bodily functioning or from a social and cultural environment. Readiness is necessary to further development, but it is not a sufficient cause of such development. So let's unpack that a little bit. Essentially, what he's saying readiness is a process where in your body, your mind, or something in the environment, it just reaches that tipping point that helps people get to an emotional cognitive state where they're capable of dealing with a certain stimulus that occurs in the environment that they're not or that they are then ready to deal with. So I'm trying not to use the word ready to self-define itself. But so for example, someone might go to college and they could be a Caucasian student and they're paired with let's say a Latino roommate. And they've never really interacted with Latinos. They've lived in a very rural community. And that for some people could be something they're ready for. And for others, there might not be the skill set there to deal with someone of a different race and culture. Now, Sanford would say that there is a certain point in time when the environmental stimulus out there, which could be having a roommate who's of a different race than oneself, can actually stimulate growth. So when he's talking about readiness being necessary to further development, you have to have the basic skills to interact with others, in this example, to have conversations with others, to speak in ways that are curious rather than judgmental, to begin to interact with someone who's different from you. So Sanford would argue that. He would also say that it's not just readiness that is a sufficient cause of development. So it's not just readiness that will then lead to development, but you have to have readiness. It has to be there before you can develop further. So we'll get into some other concepts. Now, how does development occur? Slide 17. Here's where one of his two key terms everybody seems to know comes in: challenge. How does development occur? Quote, the essential point is that a person develops through being challenged. For change to occur, there must be internal or external stimuli, having a roommate different from oneself, which upset his existing equilibrium. I'll talk about that in a second. Which cause instability that existing modes of adaptation do not suffice to correct, and which thus require the person to make new responses and so to expand his personality. So, challenge is essentially something new, in this case, having a roommate different from oneself, that upsets the existing equilibrium. An existing equilibrium might be defined as your expectations for what life is like, for your sense of this is how things are, this is what I'm used to. And what I might be used to if I live from a small rural Caucasian community is other people who look like me. I'm not used to being around other people who don't look like me. So that can upset their equilibrium. They can think like, whoa, what's going on here? Don't know how to deal with this. And so the person then will need to make some new responses. How do I interact with this person? They may speak a different language as their primary language. They may not. Who knows? But how do I grow as a person, adapt in my personality, expand in my personality, to interact with this difference? And that process of interaction, that being confronted with something different, with something that is unfamiliar, is a challenge in a Sanfordian sense. So slide 18 gives you perhaps a more clear definition that it's a stimuli that upsets the student's equilibrium, a little short there. And it's something that requires a new response to the world around them. So what challenge does is it pushes students to reach beyond their status quo. Okay, if you're going to grow, you need new experiences. Those new experiences will help you grow. So it pushes them beyond their comfort zone. You'll hear a lot of speeches at the beginning of a first year in college. Get out of your comfort zone. Do something that pushes beyond your status quo. Do something new. Have a learning experience. Well, that's all rooted in a desire for students to experience some level of challenge. Now, all challenge is not developmental. And challenge can be obviously ego-threatening, very difficult. And in fact, if challenge is so great, whoa, can't deal with this, this is something so unfamiliar, I don't know how to handle it, that is when another concept comes forward. The individual can reach a breaking point and they retreat. So let's say, in our example here, let's say Caucasian male moves in, Latino male is his roommate. He can't deal with that. He has no idea how to deal with anyone different from him because he's only known people similar to him. In some students, that could reach a breaking point in the sense of they say, I got to get out of this room. I need a different roommate right away. So that can be a retreat. So you'll see in a lot of colleges and universities, like a 3-week moratorium on roommate changes in the beginning of the year. Well, that is designed in a lot of cases to make sure that people experience the challenge they might need to grow. At the same time, for some students, the challenge is too great and they retreat. They may not only demand a different roommate, they may drop out. Now, that's pretty extreme and pretty rare. But there are people who essentially just simply aren't ready and they do retreat. So the challenge is so overwhelming, they just shut down. And at that point, development doesn't occur in some people. So on slide 19, what do we need to deal with challenge? Things that are unfamiliar to us, things that upset our existing equilibrium. We need, the second word everybody knows about Sanford, support. So the way Sanford describes support is that it's variables that uphold or sustain while new behaviors or attitudes are initiated. So if you think about someone who's walking on a high wire across 2 buildings, which I would not recommend doing. But if one did, the support might be the bar that they're holding to help balance themselves. Now, does that make walking on a high wire between 2 buildings easy? No, of course it doesn't. But it provides the support the person might need. It provides the balance the person might need to walk across that difficult terrain. So it can also be described as the stabilizing force, that which helps someone as they're going through an unfamiliar situation that makes the challenge more manageable. Getting back to our example, it could be a resident assistant who's very helpful in helping the 2 roommates figure out how to get to know each other, how to interact, how to respond to each other's differences in a way that's accepting and also that where they can get along and share space together. So that support. Now, a lot of people think we just need to throw all this support at college students and that's all we need to worry about. Wrong. There actually are, according to Sanford, there can be too much support, there can be too little support. And so one of the things that Sanford postulated was a process of stagnation. So that's essentially where someone is so supported that their support system is so great that they're not challenged and therefore they don't develop. So think about a student whose parents have always done everything for them, has never let them experience anything that could be troubling, that could be perceived as failure, anything at all. So having a soccer team where you don't keep score and everybody gets a medal at the age of 16. Okay, sometimes that happens with kids the age of 5 because they don't quite know what to do. And it's actually kind of funny to watch 5-year-olds playing soccer. But be that as it may, generally speaking, 16-year-olds, when they play soccer, they keep score. Someone wins, someone loses, and people have to deal with that kind of experience of experiencing failure. However, some people are so overly supported that they stagnate and they don't develop anymore because they're not challenged. So what Sanford also said, which I think is interesting, is that if students, quote, fail to find support in any satisfactory peer group, there is considerable likelihood that they will find the situation intolerable and leave college. So here is an important piece of wisdom. that it is a peer group that is so powerful. And if you read books like Pasquarella and Teranzini, other books that have talked about what's important in college to keep them there, they need a group of friends, a group of peers around them who help them through their college experience. That could be a floor in a residence hall, a suite, an apartment, whichever. It could be a student organization, but they need a peer group where they feel like they belong. That's a key to success in college, to retention, to persistence, and all of those things. And a lot of those concepts came originally from Sanford. Now, if you look at slide 21, what a lot of people think of in his theory is that we need to keep challenge and support on the same level, that we need equal amounts of challenge and support to have development occur. Well, look at slide 22. Not necessarily equal amounts. When students are in their first year of college, they can handle less challenge. They need more support. So what student affairs professionals and student development professionals need to do is give them much more support than they might give a student later on. If you look at slide 23, by the time someone reaches their senior year, in order to keep growing, they need more and more challenge. If they get too much support, they'll stagnate. But they still need some support, it's just not as much as they might have when they were a first-year student. Now, here is a term that I think is critical for you to understand if you want to understand, Sanford and his theory. The relationship between challenge and support is all about optimal mismatch. It's also called optimal dissonance. Either term essentially means the same thing: optimal mismatch, optimal dissonance. What that concept means is that we need that optimal mismatch, I will define that, between challenge and support in order to encourage students to grow, develop, and change. So you don't necessarily need, with an optimal mismatch, you don't need equal levels all the time. In some situations, you need more support, less challenge, some more challenge, less support, depending upon the individual, depending upon their life experience, depending upon their environment. Someone who's lived in a rural community forever and ever and never seen a person of a different race gets into a room and has someone who's living with them of a different race. They're going to need a lot more support to provide that optimal mismatch for the challenge that might exist. Now, someone who has lived around people different from themselves always won't even think twice about living with someone who's of a different race than themselves. They don't need a lot of support. There might be some challenge in that because they haven't experienced that kind of difference before in their living space, but they're kind of used to interacting with people who look different from them. So we're looking at the difference between challenge, or the relationship between challenge and support. On page 25, what we'll see is that optimal mismatch, where the balance between challenge and support must occur, is necessary for development. And so part of our challenge as student development professionals in working with each and every student is figuring out how much challenge and how much support do they need in this situation to have the optimal mismatch to promote development. And one of the things that Sanford talked about was that you can promote development by offering the individual some challenges that require new responses, and at the same time offering sufficient support for the student to confront the challenge. So they need to get out of their comfort zone. They need to be challenged through difference, challenged through new experience, but with enough of a safety system that they don't sort of retreat and say, I can't handle this. So they need that optimal mismatch. Now, the slide 26, I emphasize that an optimal mismatch is, of course, going to be different for every student. And it's going to depend upon the challenge and support that's provided in the environment, as well as the student's characteristics. So are they outgoing? Are they more reserved? Are they private? Are they more public? Are they extroverted, introverted, sensing, intuitive? Who knows what? But a lot of how they deal with challenge and support will relate to their background, what they've experienced, and that will relate to how much challenge and support might be needed. Now, I encourage you On the slide 27, I say we should meet Nevitt Sanford. If you follow that URL, it's and for those of you who don't have the slides, it's http://video.sc.edu/sanford/sanford.mov. Take a look at that. There's nothing like hearing a theorist talk in their own voice, and I would encourage you to meet him, because it's a neat resource there. Now, I would encourage you to have a number of questions that are based on Sanford's theory just in your bailiwick of things to do as we interact with students as student development professionals. And I give you some questions on slide 28 that I think can help you promote students' development. So as you think about a situation, any situation you might be dealing with an individual student, even a group of students, but here talking about the individual, you have a student who's maybe acting out on a residence hall floor, who is being confrontational to an inappropriate way in a student organization. You have almost any numbers of things happening. Look at that situation through the framework that Sanford developed, and I give you some questions there to look at individual situations. Think about those as we think about situations so that we can best figure out, how do we move forward? How do we best help this student? Not only how do we just make this problem go away, how do we help the student grow? And so I'd encourage you to consider those. Sanfords Concepts, as I stated on page 29, also can help us understand other theories, which is one of the reasons why I think it's the best first theory to learn. And that is that when we think about other theories, and particularly stage theories that go from one point to another of more complexity, generally speaking, the supports for students are in the current stage. The challenge is in the next stage. So getting to that next stage involves challenge, and in fact, moving to that next stage, you need challenge to move. But things that exist in your current stage can be supportive. And so as you think about other theories, as you learn about other theories, think about that in terms of how the individual might experience challenge moving into the next stage. What is challenging them about that stage? How are they currently supported in their current stage? I give you some references, of course, if you want to read more about this, and I'd encourage you to do so. So just wrapping up, Sanford was a complex individual. He wrote a complex theory. It's not all about challenge and support. It's really about optimal mismatch. It's about optimal dissonance. And as we interact with students, let's think about, how do we create environments that would help students reach that optimal dissonance, and how do we interact with each student to help them get there? So thank you for listening to this, and I hope that you make great use of Nevitt Sanford's theory.